You have tuned into The Voice of Medicine, the medical podcast filled with remarkable stories, first-hand experience, important research, and valuable life lessons. Open your mind, relax, and enjoy. Welcome to another edition of The Voice of Medicine. Today with me, Michael, and my guest, Professor Thomas Seyfried. Professor Seyfried is a biology professor who especially looks into the field of cancer research. His view on cancer was called controversial by many from the medical society, and yet he goes on trying to get closer to the truth of this abnormal and fatal self-growth. His work includes therapeutical progress in epilepsy and lipid storage diseases. He wrote many articles, among them all on the topic of cancer. His latest book is called Reduction of Sporadic Melanosis by Stimulation of Cellular Repair. I am very happy that he's here, and I'm looking forward to an open and critical discourse about cancer with him.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I would like to start with a quote of yours, which I found, and it caught my attention. You said, "Standard of care should never be written into granite, but it should be flexible." I think it's a very deep quote. I imagine it also comes as a reaction to many opposing voices to your research of cancer. And for those who do not know, so our listeners, can you tell us a little bit about your path into the cancer research, and why do you have to go against a medical mainstream if there is medical mainstream? Yes,
well, thank you very much. We have been investigating cancer now for many decades. We segued into this field through our work with epilepsy and using therapeutic ketosis to manage epileptic seizures. And we found that the management of seizures was related to the level of low glucose and elevation of ketone. It still remains unclear exact the molecular mechanisms by which ketones and glucose manage epileptic seizures. But when we started to evaluate, we found calorie restriction was just as effective as ketogenic diets in managing seizures. We then found that you could do the same thing for cancer by lowering blood sugar and elevating ketones, which was more understandable in light of the work of Otto Warburg many years ago, when he said the origin of cancer is due to damage to the mitochondrial respiratory system in step 1. And step 2 was the transition from oxphos to fermentation, and glucose is the main fermentable fuel. So when we then transitioned from epilepsy over to our cancer systems, we were able to show direct correlations between the levels of blood sugar and how fast a tumor grows, which is the production of lactic acid and tumor metabolism, glucose metabolism. And it became very clear that we were able to support Otto Warburg's central theory based on a shift from glucose to ketones. The issue, of course, is that cancer cells, because they have damaged oxidative phosphorylation, they can't use the ketone bodies for energy. So it becomes very clear now, if you want to stop cancer or slow it down significantly, you must transition away from the primary fermentable fuel and allow the body to transition over to a non-fermentable fat product, which is ketone body. This would then stress the tumor cells, because the tumor cells need the glucose, and you're lowering their primary fuel and asking them to burn another fuel which they can't burn because they're defective. This then shows how you can marginalize and separate cancer cells from the rest of the body. And now we know that in addition to glucose, the tumor cell ferments an amino acid called glutamine, the most abundant amino acid in the body. So when you can target both glucose and glutamine simultaneously, you deprive the tumor cell of its prime fermentable fuels. And there's no other fuel in the microenvironment present in sufficient quantities that can replace glucose and glutamine. So consequently, step 1, you transition the body over to therapeutic ketosis, and then you simultaneously target glucose and glutamine. And this should conceptually remove tumors from the body, because all cancers are the same disease. They all ferment. So they all become susceptible to the same general theory, same general approach. And we have written many papers on this, and there's a number of people that are using this with good success. So you come back to saying the standard of care. Why the metabolic therapy is successful is because it's based on the fundamental underpinnings of what the disease actually is. Cancer is a mitochondrial metabolic disease. It is not a genetic disease. And the nuclear transfer experiments provide the strongest evidence to date to say that it can't be a genetic disease. So that then questions the majority of therapies that are being used to treat patients around the world. If it's not a genetic disease, why are you using toxic chemo and radiation? Why are you using immunotherapies? All of those are based on the gene theory. And if the gene theory is incorrect, then it makes no sense to pursue with those kinds of therapies. So there must be other reasons for using those therapies other than the effective management of the disease. And as I said, what I just said to you is there's a lot of information to support what I've just said. So the standard of care involves radiation and chemo. The standard of care is based on the concept that cancer is a genetic disease. So therefore, we have to question the use of the standard of care if it's based on a false and a misunderstanding of what the actual disease is.
So, I mean, down the line, all of the medical staff, all doctors, researchers, or at least what they should want is for patients to get better, right? To improve health condition and so on. Why do you think is there so much, defensive position against your approach? So why are they holding on to the genetic underlying hypotheses about cancer?
Because I don't think they've read the scientific literature, or they're unfamiliar with it. They either have never read this, or they're simply unfamiliar. Also, their training is not designed to do this. So they go through a very rigorous training protocol, which discusses, not the origin of cancer or the biology of the disease, but rather how much radiation can we give to a person before killing them, or how much chemo should we give to a patient before we kill them or damage them significantly. This is irrelevant to the nature of what the disease actually is. So you're not being trained. You're not being, why? Because if you know that the disease is based on a metabolic platform, and you know the cancer cells cannot live without fermentable fuels, why is there no general therapy targeting fermentable fuels? Because the field is not trained to understand this. They don't read the biological literature. They're unfamiliar. You can ask a lot of oncologists, do they know the theory, Warburg's central theory? And you'll find a lot of people in the cancer field never heard of Otto Warburg. So, I mean, this is how can you work in a disease when you don't know the founding issues of the disease you're working on? I mean, many do, and they say, well, Warburg was disproved. By who? What are the experiments that disproved Warburg? And then they have trouble trying to find this. Well, cancer cells take in oxygen, therefore he's wrong. No. The oxygen is uncoupled it's not related to the formation of ATP. You got to look at the data. We published a lot of papers on this. And, most of these papers are understood by the lay public. They seem to understand it more than the oncologists or the scientists. So it's really kind of an interesting situation. But in time, people will come to know. They have to, because we can't continue down the same path. In the United States, we have 1,600 people a day dying from cancer every day. In China, it's 8,100 a day. The population is larger. Obviously, whatever we're doing to manage the disease has become a failure. The new immunotherapies, they just received the Nobel Prize for this kind of stuff. The immunotherapies are based on the gene theory of cancer. And you have just as a probability of dying from the immunotherapy as you have from have it managed. This is completely understandable if you're functioning on a false premise of what the disease actually is. So you can explain the majority of what's happening in the cancer field by just simply asking, are these people being treated based on the fundamental understanding of what the disease actually is? And if it's not, then you can account for the problems that we're having.
I also, when I was reading about your research and what you were finding out, is what I didn't understand, probably a little bit more technical, is what is the relation between the fermentation process, right, because of the glucose, and then inflammation processes. Can you explain that a little?
Well, inflammation is a provocative factor for the origin of cancer. We know that systemic inflammation can damage respiratory system mitochondria in certain population of cells of the body. This is why we now see an explosion of new cancers in people that have type 2 diabetes and obesity. Because if you look at the levels of C-reactive protein in the bloodstream of many of these folks, which is a marker for systemic inflammation, you find it elevated. So elevation of systemic inflammation can put cells in our body at risk for a mitochondrial impairment, which is the first step in the origin of cancer. So mitochondrial impairment is gradually compensated for cells that can ferment. That is, they can slowly and gradually shift their metabolism from oxidative phosphorylation, which is mitochondrial dependent, oxphos dependent, to a fermentation metabolism, which can occur both in the mitochondria and in the cytoplasm, but requires totally different pathways and requires a lot more available fuel. So inflammation damages respiration, putting cells on the path to forming tumors in various parts of the body, depending on the cells that happen to be damaged.
Thank you very much for clarifying that for me. Now, another question which I was asking myself is, so it's all about mitochondria, right? How do we keep them healthy?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. And you say to yourself, well, we should then be able to prevent cancer by simply keeping our mitochondria healthy. And the answer is yes, absolutely. The problem is it's very difficult to do this. So we live in Western civilization now. We're bombarded by all kinds of foods and lifestyles that put ourselves at risk for respiratory damage. Not only are we living in some environments that have chemical carcinogens that put ourselves at risk, in the air that we breathe is less healthy. The foods that we eat are often eliciting systemic inflammation, foods that are nutritionally barren, that have high carbohydrates. All of this will put us at risk for developing cancer. So how do you prevent that? Well, water-only therapeutic fasting can restore the health and vitality of mitochondria. But this is extremely difficult to do. Most people on the planet do not do this. Now, some people do it; it's part of their religion or whatever. But if you can burn ketone bodies, which come from the mobilization of fats, ketone bodies can rejuvenate mitochondria in the cells of our body, making them much more resistant to developing reactive oxygen species which damage mitochondria, thereby putting the cells at risk for cancer. But therapeutic fasting can certainly do that. Therapeutic ketosis is the shift in the body from glucose or carbohydrate fuels to fats and ketone bodies, and this will enhance. Ketone bodies are better than fats. Fatty acids can generate reactive oxygen species, whereas ketone bodies do not. So it's called therapeutic ketosis, where the levels of ketones are elevated and the levels of the blood sugars are reduced, and that will enhance the vitality of mitochondria, making them more resistant to damage and less likely to go on the path to carcinogenesis. But these are difficult things to do, and it requires a lot of personal discipline, and it requires lifestyle and changes. And I'm not sure how many people on the planet want to do this.
So let's take a average person who is very interested in health, maybe even heard about your research, and has the discipline. What would be an example of a very simplified ketogenic therapeutic diet, and how long do people need to keep it up to actually have any effect?
Well, the term diet is always an ambiguous statement anyway, and this is, I think, is one of the turnoffs to the medical profession about this kind of strategy, because as soon as you mention diet in the context of any kind of a medicine, people just walk away because they always figure it's too ambiguous. But what we call it is metabolic therapy, ketosis, right? Ketogenic metabolic therapy. This can happen by not only diets, but just restricting the amount of food you eat, and then eating certain foods that will facilitate the elevation of ketone bodies, and that can differ from one person to the next. So what combination of foods and exercise and lifestyle issues may work for one person may not be as effective for another person. This is why we developed the glucose ketone index, which is a blood marker. It's a biomarker to allow people to know whether or not they're in therapeutic ketosis. And some people can do this with one type of food or another type of food. So it's not really a specific diet. It's a combination of exercise and different combinations of foods. And what could put one person into therapeutic ketosis might not be as effective as another person, or vice versa. So we have a glucose ketone monitor. It's a little meter that sometimes people with diabetes use, and they can then take a drop of their blood, and they can use one little strip to determine their blood sugar and another little strip to determine their blood ketone levels, and you get the ratio in millimolar, and that tells you whether or not you're in therapeutic ketosis, and also the degree of therapeutic ketosis. Some people could be in mild ketosis, others are in moderate, and some people are in high ketosis. So the meter will allow a person to know what level of therapeutic ketosis they're in, and what they're doing. So if they're not in therapeutic ketosis, they can tweak their exercise and lifestyle issues to bring them into that zone. So it becomes at least it's a biomarker to allow people to be on the same plane, rather than saying, oh, I'm eating that or this, and you should eat that diet or that. All that stuff becomes very ambiguous. The bottom line is, are you in therapeutic ketosis, or are you not? And some people say, well, I've been eating this and been eating that, and I can't get in. Well, we'll measure your blood. Just work it until you are in therapeutic ketosis. If you don't think it's going to work, stop eating for a week. You'll definitely be in therapeutic ketosis. So then you can brace yourself for that.
That would be a very harsh way how to get there, but I'm sure.
I'm not an advocate of that. People think I'm not going to. I tried that. It's hard. It's not easy. The older you get, the harder it is. And young people can do it, but they don't like it. Who likes it? I mean, you're living in a society where you have tremendously delicious food all the time, and you're going to say, I'm going to drink water now for a week. And it's hard. Some people do it longer. I mean, you always get people on the planet that will do one of these things. They become a real advocate. But I'm not one of those. If I had cancer, I might consider doing that, but I don't have cancer. But I know what to do if I had cancer. I mean, I would get myself into therapeutic ketosis, and then I would start hammering away. But you have to know what to do, and you have to be willing to try it. And if people, I have a lot of friends that are in therapeutic ketosis on a regular basis. They eat. You can get into ketosis on an Atkins diet, which is more meat and things. But I wouldn't do that if I were to have cancer, because there's too much protein in the diet. So cancer is one thing. Therapeutic ketosis is another. The type of therapeutic ketosis you need for cancer is a little different than Atkins diets and things like this. So this is one of this is why we have the glucose ketone index monitor, to allow everybody to know what degree of ketosis they're in.
So on one hand, we can use the therapeutic ketosis to work prophylactically against cancer, right? And on the other hand, we can also use it as a actual treatment if somebody already has cancer. Now, I would like to know, to which stage of cancer progress are you still going to have, I would say, effects or good results with this therapeutical method, by starving the cells?
You have to realize that therapeutic ketosis removes the fuel glucose to the tumors, but it does not remove the fuel of glutamine to the tumors. And glutamine is the other fuel that drives the fermentation. So it's unlikely, although I have to be honest with you, I see some humans that get into really good therapeutic ketosis, and for whatever reason, their tumors seem to resolve. But many don't, and because they haven't targeted the other fuel. So the combination of knowing, number one, you get into therapeutic ketosis, and then number two, you have to start working on controlling the glutamine. And the glutamine must be controlled, at least in my mind at this point, with drugs. You can't do it with any kind of food intervention, diet intervention. None of this will work on glutamine, because glutamine can be synthesized in our body. It's considered a non-essential. It's an essential amino acid, but it's considered non-essential because we can make it from other sources. So then you have to use drugs. So so the best approach to managing cancer is to, if you're on early stages, then the cancer in early stages should be very easily managed with metabolic therapy, knowing how to do this. You don't really want to subject yourself to biopsies, radiation therapy, radical surgery, or any of this kind of stuff. You shouldn't really have to do that for the most part anyway. Now, if the cancer is advanced and has metastasized, which is a sign of advanced cancer, then you know that the metastatic cells are heavily dependent on glutamine and glucose together. So it's going to require a combination of therapeutic ketosis together with specific drugs that target the glutamine. But again, you don't want to be subjecting your body to toxic poisons, radical surgical treatments, or massive amounts of radiation, because that contributes to systemic inflammation, weakens your body to be able to adjust to the new metabolic state, and eventually puts you at risk for death. So, which is ultimately what happens to so many of these cancer patients. And we really don't know today, with any good degree of understanding, how many of the cancer patients are dying from their disease or dying from the toxic treatments used to try to manage their disease. So this is another tragedy. Why are we using such toxic therapies to treat a metabolic problem? So if we readjust the metabolism of the body, we can marginalize these cancer cells, deprive them of the fuels that are using to grow. Don't forget, no cell can grow without energy. It's a fact of biology and biochemistry. Without energy, nothing can grow. Just take cyanide and you find out how quickly it kills a human being, right? Energy stops, you die. So the cancer cells are dependent on fermentable fuels. If you deprive them of their fermentable fuels, they can't make energy and they will die. So it's not that complicated, but it becomes extremely complicated when you feel that the disease is a genetic disease and all these mutations are playing a role, and they're largely irrelevant. So you can wipe away this whole mutation thing and focus only on the energy part, and take away the energy of the tumor cells while using ketones to enhance the energy of the normal cells. Because the tumor cells can't use the ketones, but the normal cells can. So you can completely marginalize these cancer cells and then take away their glucose, and be very careful on how you take away their glutamine. Because the glutamine that the tumor cells are using is the same fuel that our immune cells are using. So if I kill a lot of tumor cells, I have to have an immune system to come in and pick up the corpses, the dead cells that we just killed. Mm-hmm. And if the immune system is paralyzed because you used a drug to kill tumor cells, but at the same time paralyzed your immune system, then you run into another problem. So you have to know, number one, you need to know what the tumor cells need to survive, and you have to understand the biology, the system's biology of what you're dealing with. So focusing on a lump or a lesion specifically is the wrong way to go. It's a whole body system. You're going to train your body to turn against the tumor cells with the help of a new physiological state and drugs that specifically target the fermentable fuels. So it's a completely new design for cancer management, and most people will benefit because you also target many of the other chronic problems that these cancer patients have. Many of these cancer patients have diabetes. Many of them have cardiovascular. They have many other maladies besides having a tumor. So many of those other maladies are also managed while at the same time you're eradicating their tumor. It's a slow process. It doesn't happen overnight. But we think we can achieve the same time frame as what most standard therapies would do. 6 to 8, 9 months, something along these lines. And you should be resolved, or at least on the road to management without toxicity. So this is the strategy, and you're right. I mean, the problem is that the majority of oncologists in the world don't understand this. I don't know if they don't understand it. They never heard about it. They're not trained to do this. This is not part of their training. So,
did you actually have also positive or productive cooperation with oncologists? Yeah.
Yes. So oncologists who are really interested in helping their patients. I don't want to say that oncologists are not interested in helping their patients. It's just that they should know by the track record how many people are surviving and how many people really get very, very sick from the treatments they're using. Why should we have to take a patient and make him very, very sick in order to help him? Now, I'm not saying some cancer patients take massive doses of poison and radiation. They don't seem to get sick. But the majority of people do. If I take a mouse and give him chemo and radiation, the mouse gets extremely sick. If I take a dog and do the same thing to the dog gets very, very sick. I mean, when we take toxic poisons and radiation, most people get sick. And why are we doing that? To treat a disease that's a metabolic disease when you shouldn't have to go through this sickness. You see bald-headed people from being treated with cancer. Why do their hair fall out? Why should anybody's hair have to fall out when you take the energy away from the tumor cell? So you're using therapies that have a lot of off-target effects. They harm the body in doing these kinds of things. And why are you doing this? Because you want to stop the proliferation of these cells that are growing out of control. So you want to target their DNA, you want to target their cytoskeleton, you want to make them so they can't divide. Just pull their energy out. They can't divide without energy. If you take away their ATP, they'll die just as well without the toxicity. They have to understand the biology and biochemistry of the very disease you're treating. So if oncologists know this, they are often willing to do it. The problem is, and there's some especially the young people, they're very eager to know how to do all this, but then they're stymied by the very hospitals they work in because it's not part of the standard of care, and it won't be approved by the hospital's review board because it's very different from what everybody else has been doing and being trained to do. So you have all of these. So even if you want to do it, sometimes you can't do it because of the systems that are already in place.
Do you personally think this is also a question of money, since the treatments that are used now basically render more money down the line than if you would treat patients with therapeutic ketosis?
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I mean, there's no question that the therapies that we use to treat cancer patients today are high revenue generators, whether it's the chemicals that you buy, whether it's the radiation that you use, the immunotherapies that are massively very expensive today. This is not; these are not going to be for the majority of people on the planet. They can't afford this kind of stuff. It's just not going to be applicable to most people. So revenue generation is an important part of the cancer platform. And my viewpoint is, why should we have to charge so much money just to rescue the lives of some people when we can do it without generating? And I think this is a really important issue because it's going to be very difficult to adapt a metabolic therapy. How can metabolic therapy replace the revenue from some of the high generating revenue therapies? And this has not yet been fully addressed. I'm sure, we use hyperbaric oxygen in replace of radiation therapy. Can you charge can you replace the cost of radiation with hyperbaric? I don't know. These are different issues than what my focus is on. How do we eradicate the disease without harming the rest of the body? I'm not into knowing how we can replace revenue generation with one form of therapy for another. I do know that most people would like to live, and they would like to live without debilitating adverse effects. I think that's common knowledge to most people. I would like to have my disease managed, and I would not like to know that we can do this without losing hair or having all kinds of other horrific physiological consequences of my treatment. Many people fear the treatment as much as they do the disease, and rightly so. You can die from the treatments that they give you, or make your body so weak you can no longer resist the growth of the tumor cell. So all of this has to change. It's an incomplete mindset. But I know I'm right because the biology is based on the shoulders of giants in the field, Otto Warburg and others, who have clearly shown the origin of this disease. We have also shown and identified the missing link in Warburg's central theory, that it was the glutamine fermentation that he did not know about. So I believe that his concept was right. So the biochemistry and the biology of the basis of the disease is understood now. Now, whether people accept it or not is a different issue, but we understand it. We have a pathway to go for resolution without toxic side effects, and it's just a matter of time before the rest of the people come to know this. And how long will that be? I don't know. It's just, but people want to live and they don't want to be, tortured. And
absolutely. Absolutely. You have mentioned something very important as you were speaking now, that people often are very afraid of the treatment. And I know of some people, they said they would actually rather go without the treatment and just, simply die because of cancer than going through radiotherapy or any other treatment, which would basically mean suffering. And do you believe that your work and work of people, who are in the same boat as you are, is also demystifying this big word cancer for the normal population? Because for a lot of people, this is, when they hear cancer, that's the synonym for suffering, fear number one. This is where they know, if I get it, it's over. They've probably had, their relatives having this issue. Do you think this also helps to clarify certain things about cancer and make it more, how should I say, less threatening, although it's still very serious?
Yes, I think so. Exactly. It's not, when you understand it from the perspective of a metabolic disease, it's far less complicated than it is when you view the disease from the perspective of the somatic mutation theory, which is the dogmatic view of what cancer is. If you go anywhere in the world today at the top medical schools, you hear that cancer is a genetic disease, extremely complicated. Everybody's cancer is different. This is all nonsense. Because it's based on a false understanding of what the disease is. Yes, there are many mutations in tumors, and each tumor cell has a different constellation of mutations from any other cell, and everybody's tumor is a little different from everybody else's. But those are all downstream effects. They're all effects. They're not the cause. All the tumor cells are fermenters. That's the commonality of the disease. So once you realize that every kind of cancer, whether it's a colon, breast, bladder, brain cancer, they're all fermenting, and that makes them all the same. It's just that this guy happens to have it in his bladder, this person in the breast, this person in the prostate, this guy in the pancreas, this person in the brain. But if you look at the biochemistry and biology of the cells, they're all the same. They're fermenting. So that means it's one disease. It's a common disease that happens in certain populations of cells, and they lose their growth control. And they lose their growth control because the very organelle that controls growth, the mitochondria, has become defective. And therefore, they're growing out of control by fermentation. And fermentation is driven by two fuels, glucose and glutamine. So it becomes very clear, if I remove the fermentable fuels, I should be able to kill the tumor. And we have preclinical evidence for this, and some people are doing it and getting the kinds of results that we would have expected. So clearly, the path is there. The framework is there. We developed a therapy called press-pulse therapeutic strategy, which then presses the glucose and pulses the glutamine to gradually degrade the tumor in a non-toxic way, making therapies far less toxic. The only issue is it does require now some level of participation on the part of the cancer patient to become compliant with these kind of things. Compliance is an issue regardless of what the strategy is to maintain it. Some people don't want to be compliant with toxic chemicals or radiation, and some people don't want to be compliant with a metabolic strategy that deprives them of some of their desirable foods. But, compliance will always be an issue regardless of what kind of treatment you're using. It's just that in metabolic therapy, the absence of compliance makes it's just a discomfort. It's not going to harm you In other words, you know what I'm saying. It's not going to be. It's going to be uncomfortable to be compliant, but it's not going to be toxic to be compliant. You know.
I understand what you mean. Yeah. If anybody wanted to, talk to you in person, or perhaps see you on a congress or somewhere in Europe, since we're a European podcast, can they do so? Are you planning on coming to Europe? Do you have a tour or something like that? Or is there already some institute or hospital that you closely work with? You know, if any of our oncologists would be interested to get a hold of you and ask you questions or discuss certain things.
Well, I will be going to Switzerland in June. They're having a big keto metabolic thing over there. I can't remember the town, but it's supposed to be very nice. I just came back from a big meeting in Los Angeles on this whole concept as well. But, you know, in Europe, there's a group in Budapest, Sophia Clemens and Dr. Toth, where they're applying a metabolic strategy.
I have heard the Hungarians are pretty high on these topics, and they're actually working towards it. Yeah.
And I think, you know, our group in Turkey, Istanbul, is probably the most advanced group of oncologists that have really started to adapt. They combine metabolic therapy with very low dose chemotherapies to reduce toxicity, and their results are becoming really far better than any other group I've seen anywhere in the world with respect to the level of management they're able to get for a broad range of advanced stage 4 cancers, including pancreatic cancer, non-small cell lung cancer, ovarian cancer, triple negative breast cancer. Now, not everybody survives because we're still in the experiment. We're still in the developmental phase. And a lot of the patients that don't survive, you know, we have not targeted effectively their glutamine metabolism, then we know we have to do this. So it's a work in progress. I'm not saying we have a solution to the cancer problem. I think we have a pathway, a strategy that will bring us to a far greater level of management and resolution than currently exists with the standard therapies. So this is all a work in progress. We're now linking different oncology groups around the world, in Brazil, in Alexandria, Egypt, in Istanbul, in Turkey, and now in the United States and in China. And we're bringing together oncologists where we can all share our findings and ideas into better utilizing this approach for the management of cancer. And I think this is what's going to happen. It's just a matter of time once we get to, and it's going to be, it'll be for the benefit of all people, regardless of their income status. So the poor people who can't afford any of these things can be managed effectively if they understand what needs to be done. So it's going to be a worldwide capability of managing cancer for the majority of people, not just a select few. As a matter of fact, the select few who do have the means to take immunotherapies, they put themselves at incredible risk for death. It seems like, you know, we have very, very wealthy people in this country, and we read about this in the Wall Street Journal, you know, the International Journal of Finance, and you find that very wealthy people like Paul Allen and Blake Nordstrom, Paul Allen of Microsoft and Blake Nordstrom of the department stores. These poor folks died in 2 weeks from these therapies. You know, no one will die in 2 weeks from metabolic therapy. I can tell you that. So the wealthy will be the ones, probably the last, because they run off to the top medical schools to get treated. The poor people can't afford that. So if they do metabolic therapy, they're going to do a hell of a lot better than going off to these very expensive treatments that could potentially kill you. You know, and so, yeah, once we have the pathway defined, and we're working on it, we have preclinical systems right now. We vet everything in the preclinical systems so that the oncologists and physicians know that if they apply this strategy to their patients, there's a good probability that the patient will live far longer in a healthier state, quality of life, and not die in 2 weeks or 3 weeks from any kind of a toxic issue. So it's a work in progress. And we're all feeding each other new information, and the numbers of new ways that we can manage cancer without toxicity will be just absolutely amazing. So we're not doing that now because people are focusing on thinking cancer is a genetic disease. So you don't think about these other things if you're locked into a dogmatic view. So this dogmatic view has to be pushed aside, and we have to recognize what the disease actually is. And there's when we're going to really see the big advances and the management of the disease, so that it won't be so fearful. Oh, I have cancer. Yeah, it's spread, but don't worry. We can manage this. You'll be fine for the next. You won't have to worry about, a lot of these things if we have knowledgeable practitioners who understand this and can apply it to their patients.
Well, I guess there were always, revolutionaries in every science. I count you among them in this kind of, in that sense, in the cancer research. Thank you very much for taking your time, explaining me and my audience your research and how everything should work out. And I'm very happy that you are on my show. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. A real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
This was The Voice of Medicine. Make sure you tune in next time and take care.